This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility, we come.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
There are moments in the history of nations when a decisive instant comes. The coming vote is not an election, but a decision between two worlds, the world of internationalism and that of the true German spirit. One must decide between a Germany riven by classes, parties, religions, and the Germany of one will, one goal. The last 13 years have brought misery, destruction. No one else could have destroyed the national wealth, created millions of unemployed so well. These 13 years have led to 30 parties, all arrayed against one. All elements have their parties. Only the German Volk has none. But the National Socialist German Workers' Party will never give up the struggle, for only it has the courage to act. Adolf Hitler, speaking to an NSDAP rally in central Germany, July 1932. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Patreon-only episode of History Off the Page. In today's session, we'll be looking more closely at the Nazi seizure of power on the local level, through a review of events in a small German town called Northeim. And we're doing this because after doing a lot of sort of broader, more thematic episodes on the Nazi seizure of power, I wanted to give you a more intimate, a more specific look at what the Nazi takeover looks like and feels like for ordinary people. What does it mean for the ordinary German, for the average person, to experience these momentous historical changes, not from the view of 10,000 feet and, here's all these institutions and here's all this cultural change, here's all the big politics going on. But what does this look like from the perspective of someone on an average street in an average town? How do they experience these changes? How do their neighbors feel about it? In short, what does it look like to live through this moment of transition to fascism? So again, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the rise of the Nazis in the small German town of Northeim. We're going to cover the story in this first episode, basically up to January 30th, 1933, the moment that Hitler is appointed as Chancellor. Today's episode, in many ways, kind of focuses on the question of how do the Nazis go from being kind of afterthoughts, kind of people that are a splinter party, that nobody's really interested or following in, they're kind of minor, even insignificant before 1930, how do they go in just the span of a couple years to the most powerful party in Germany, to Hitler himself being appointed Chancellor? In the next episode, we'll talk about what happens after 1933 and how the Nazis build a dictatorship in this small town. Again, just because you get the most votes in an election, that doesn't mean that you have kind of authorization from the broader populace to build a totalitarian dictatorship. That's a pretty different and a pretty big kind of jump there. So the second episode that we're going to do, the one after this, will cover kind of post-1933. Finally, as a friendly reminder, this is a free preview of a part of a larger episode that is available to our Patreon subscribers. If you want access to the whole thing, head on over to Patreon or visit my website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can sign up to access this and other episodes for as little as $2 a month. You'll also get access to some of our other Patreon-only episodes. Right now, this includes episodes covering Hitler's early years, the history of the SS, and then a longer one basically about the history of the concentration camps. More importantly, you'll also help support our podcast. And so I just want to say, for those of you that are either supporting our podcast or some of you have made donations to the podcast, I really appreciate your support and your help. Without you, without what you do, this show couldn't be possible. And if you haven't, you might want to consider doing so. Again, $2 a month is not a whole lot of money. It's less than a cup of coffee. But if you have the ability and the inclination, we would really, really appreciate your support. Okay, so let's get back to the history. And I want to start by describing the town of Northeim for you, so you can get a sense of what it looks like before the Nazi seizure of power. Northeim is basically your typical early 20th century German town. In fact, it's so typical that if you had a map of modern-day Germany and you just decided to point right to the center of it, guess what would be right sort of almost in the middle directly would be the town of Northeim. If you want a funny way of thinking about this, picture Germany as kind of like a big dartboard, and Northeim is almost exactly where the bullseye is. It's slightly, maybe a little bit to the left, but it's almost exactly where the bullseye would be. Now, Northeim is probably best described more as a town than as a city. It has, at the start of 1932, a population of about 10,000 people, right? So this isn't one of the big cities like Berlin or Munich or Stuttgart. It's not a little village either, right? 10,000 people is a moderate size for the early 1930s. If you are a fan of Rick Steves, the kind of travel guru, Northeim is kind of one of those towns that Rick Steves likes to find and identify. It has these kind of local charms, this kind of idyllic sense, especially before World War II. If we could look at a picture of Northeim from this period, you'd see that the downtown is full of those kind of half-timbered houses that we often associate with kind of medieval Germany, or not necessarily rural Germany, but kind of like the Hansel and Gretel Germany. Northeim has cobblestone streets. And again, as late as 1930, it actually still has the old medieval city wall up. If you've ever been to Rothenburg on the Tauber, it is famous for sort of still having the city walls intact. It's a major tourist destination. Northeim in 1932 is not really that far off from Rothenburg. The interior landscape of the city is dominated by a 16th century Lutheran church. And of course, like many sort of small European towns, right next to the main church in town, you have the sort of market square. And the market square functions as kind of the main public meeting place, greeting place. It's where your festivals are going to take place, your demonstrations, your protests. Now, so far, you'll notice I haven't really talked a lot about the Nazis. And that's because before 1930, there really aren't many Nazis in the town, certainly not many Nazis that people would have noticed or thought about. Perhaps the only person that most people would have picked out and gone, oh, that guy's a Nazi, is actually someone who doesn't fit the stereotype that we usually think about when we think about Nazis. In other words, if I asked you to picture in your mind someone that's a member of the Nazi Party, especially before 1933, chances are you're thinking of somebody with the brown shirt on, an SA guy, a kind of brawler, somebody who's kind of like not fully cleanly shaven, somebody who's kind of violent, somebody who's like kind of a jerk, somebody who's certainly very masculine. But the most prominent Nazi in town before 1930 is actually a former school teacher. His name is Walter Timmerla, and he's the guy that owns the local bookstore. He's in many ways an intellectual. Timmerla is, for ideological reasons, an early and vocal supporter of Hitler's movement. His family had owned the town's local bookstore for several generations. He is someone who is well known, not just because, oh, he's a Nazi, but for his work in his local church. He is a guy that is a member of a whole bunch of civic organizations. And so one of the things that, especially in this small town, that we should note is that even though we associate Nazism with kind of violence and a sort of ruthlessness of it, we kind of think of them as one kind of Northeimer described, said basically there were two different types of Nazis, and one of them was the kind of gutter Nazi. And we would say, well, this guy Timmerlaw is not a gutter Nazi. He's not a street brawler. He's not someone who's uncouth or unsophisticated or a loser. He is, to use a simple word, very respectable. And so the Nazis before 1930 are, again, almost non-existent, and to the extent that they do exist in Northeim, they are associated with this kind of respectable middle-class bookshop owner. Now again, despite Timmerlaw's enthusiasm and his kind of placement within the sort of social scene in Northeim, neither the Nazis, nor, as we kind of discussed already, the communists, neither of them seem particularly relevant to voters, at least before 1930. In the 1928 parliamentary elections, for example, in Northeim, the Nazis receive all of 123 votes. This is a town of 10,000 people, and they get a whopping 123 votes. The communists, by the way, do even worse. They get just 28 votes. Just to give you a contrast here, the SPD will collect about 2,200 votes, and this is about 45% of the overall total. Local elections the following year largely repeat this pattern. That said, we should also note that the lack of vote share doesn't necessarily mean that the Nazi Party is inactive or non-existent. Quite the opposite. One of the things that I've tried to emphasize in the broader podcast is that even though the Nazis are small, they are hyperactive. By the first part of 1930, for example, the Nazis have held public meetings roughly every other week. And these public meetings are not the kind of bureaucratic committee, oh, there's a meeting of this committee, we're going to talk about, library circulation. Everybody get together. It's going to be really boring. We're only going to bring the nerds out. These meetings are meant to be kind of public-facing, public events, public spectacles. In 1930, they usually center around some kind of speaker. Usually that's kind of like a local speaker, but sometimes they'll bring in a professor from someplace else, maybe even eventually a Reichstag delegate, as we'll talk about in a moment. Maybe it's someone with some kind of army achievement or legacy, right? So they're trying to get these speakers. They're trying to generate enthusiasm and interest in the party. Of course, one of the best ways to do that, you don't give a speech about what you're for, or you don't give a speech where you're trying to educate people about something. The number one thing to do, if you follow social media, you know this, is to be outrageous, is to complain about things, is to get really mad, and I'm so outraged about something going on. Fortunately for the Nazis, they've got quite a bit to be outraged about. They complain about the Depression. They rail against the Versailles Treaty. They, of course, are very anti-Semitic, and so you will get occasionally speeches that are aimed at kind of spreading hatred of Jews. But the Nazis also try to make this about more than just being a lecture. And this will increasingly become sort of more interactive over time. They will say, okay, we're going to have a speech, but before the speech, we're going to have a parade. We're going to have a march. If you talk to people, especially in certain parts of Europe, especially the Balkans, they talk about how do we commemorate events. If you just have someone get up there and read a speech or light a candle, it's not very interactive. It's kind of boring for people. And so if you really want to make them feel like they are a part of the process of commemoration, give them something to do. Let them march. Let them sing a song. Let them play music or have some other kind of popular entertainment. This is a strategy used by the Nazis in late 1929, early 1930, before they have had any kind of electoral success. Now again, before 1930, these types of activities draw limited audiences. Nobody's really excited to hear what the Nazi speaker has to say about what the Nazis would do if they were in power. Everybody's heard complaints about the Versailles Treaty. It's not necessarily shocking or new. But the Nazis are clever. They have faith in what they're doing. And again, they keep this kind of high energy campaigning up. And even though it doesn't really bear fruit at the ballot box in 1930, in the first time that they do it, 2 years later, the Nazis are the largest political party in town, measured by vote share. In the 1932 presidential elections, Hitler, in both the first and second rounds of the election, he outpolls Paul von Hindenburg. And it's not necessarily close. He beats him by 500 votes in the first round, almost 1,000 votes in round two. Just to give you a sense of how big a margin that is, Ernst Thälmann is back again in 1932 running for president. This is in the middle of the Great Depression. The Communist Party has kind of grown considerably since 1925. How many votes does Ernst Thälmann get? About 100. So how do we explain this rapid transformation of the electorate? How did the Nazis win over so many voters in Northeim before the seizure of power? One of the most common answers that you get, especially if you read kind of larger sort of macro historical takes on Nazi Germany, especially those that are written in the 70s and 80s, one of the big kind of explanations you get for obvious reasons is that it's related to the Depression. And I would obviously agree that the Depression clearly plays some role in people being drawn to Nazism. But I would also argue that in the case of Northeim, this can only serve as a sort of partial explanation for what happened. In Northeim, which was not really heavily industrialized, the Depression is, one could argue, fairly mild. It is not hit by the waves of mass layoffs that occur elsewhere in Germany. The number of unemployed people in the town, for example, rises at times from about 150 people to about 300. And this fluctuation isn't linear. Part of it's driven by seasonal employment. When it's harvest time, right, the farmers in the countryside are going to hire a bunch of people to help harvest the crops. And 300 people being unemployed is obviously not optimal. Obviously, if you're one of those people that's employed, if your prospects of getting a job, it's not just, well, I'm unemployed, now I have to go find a job, but you feel like there aren't any jobs out there. Yeah, that's pretty significant. That's pretty serious. But this is hardly an eye-popping number in a town of 10,000 people. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can receive aid or welfare. It's not just for unemployment insurance. So these numbers move a little bit more. There's about 15 to 20 people when the Depression begins, and it reaches a height of about 220 people who are receiving welfare payments from the government. I'm sorry, those are emergency payments from the government. Welfare payments increase from about 100 to about 300. And so again, for the people that are going through this, those are pretty bad numbers. The situation probably seems pretty bleak. Certainly don't want to judge anyone who was in that situation who may have felt a sense of desperation. But if you put all those numbers together, you're talking about maybe 600 to 800 people in a town of 10,000 that are experiencing extreme economic distress. Are those numbers high enough? Obviously, they're high enough to create concern, but are they high enough to say, let's burn down the system? Clearly, democracy, civil rights, religious freedom, all these things, they're all to blame for this hell on earth that we're living through. Burn it down. Right? You picture like the peasants from Monty Python. Burn it down. They're talking about burning a witch, if you don't get the reference from Monty Python. So again, how do we understand the Nazis' sudden surge in enthusiasm and popularity in this small German town? The first answer to this question is political, in the sense that the Nazis are far more effective in terms of their campaign strategies, in terms of the way in which they practice politics, than any of their potential opponents. Now, we talked about this a little bit in the main podcast when we did the whole electoral warfare thing. And one of the things that the Nazis did really well was they were sort of hyperactive in their electoral activity. Between January 1930 and the seizure of power in January 1933, so across a sort of 3-year gap here, the Nazis averaged close to 3 public meetings per month. That's a lot in a small town. This isn't New York City. This isn't Berlin. This isn't Paris. There aren't really a lot of members of the party, I would add, too. I'll give you that number in just a few minutes. But we are not talking triple digits here in terms of Nazi party members in the city or in the town of Northeim. And while, as I just said, these meetings don't necessarily draw large audiences, one could argue that they carry out a much more important function. They shape public perceptions about who the Nazi Party is or what its goals are. Now, when we think today about politics, when we think about elections, whether we're talking about the United States or Japan or Europe, we are usually thinking in terms of ideology or rhetoric or even experiences. In other words, if you want to understand here in the United States, where we've had kind of political revolutions in the last 10, 15 years, one could argue, if you want to understand today's Republican or Democratic parties, many people would argue, well, okay, the best way to do that is to go look at their party platforms. Look at the speeches that their leaders are giving. What are the things that they're talking about? What is the legislation that they're proposing? Today, of course, we'd probably say go look at their social media posts. You might also think about it experientially, in the sense that how do people feel about the current parties? Well, isn't a lot of that driven by sort of environmental factors? When Joe Biden was president, wasn't there at least a significant section of the American population that didn't like the inflation going on and that blamed Democrats for that? And that was their primary way of understanding what the Democratic Party stood for. All of this, of course, is a very rational way, I would argue, of approaching the question of how do we understand electorates? How do people form their sort of perceptions of parties? However, one could also argue that there is a significant group of people out there, of voters, who are not really interested in the intellectual side of politics, or in the discursive or rhetorical side of politics. They don't want to do their own research necessarily by looking up what the party platform is. They don't want to read what the latest proposal is, on what to do about the school system or about health and disease and vaccines and things like that. And so the point I'm making here is that their ideas about not just the political parties, but also the leaders of the political parties, this derives not from the words that are being produced, whether written or whether spoken, but it comes from the image that they have of those leaders or of those parties. It comes from the assumptions that they make based on the way that the parties or their leaders appear or kind of quote unquote seem when they are doing public things. Now, I talk about contemporary politics to help you understand the historical example, but in the case of Northeim, there are many voters who, of course, read papers, who go to the meetings, who listen to the speeches. But there is also a wider subset who only encounter Nazism tangentially. These are people that are not sitting around and reading Mein Kampf. They are not going to the Stammtisch at the local Kneipe or pub so that they can get into arguments about anti-Semitism or Lebensraum or other kind of Nazi sort of either intellectual ideas or concepts or policy proposals. But what these voters do see is that the Nazis keep holding meeting after meeting after meeting. They do see that the Nazis have this kind of paramilitary organization, and even though this organization has a reputation for violence, obviously, they wear uniforms, they march around in order, they sing songs together. There's a kind of an order and a kind of unity or comradeship that one can pick up on that seems kind of good. People notice that when the SA is street brawling, who are they fighting with? They're fighting with the communists. Well, there's a lot of people out there that just don't like the communists. They are very aware of these concepts of class warfare, of the idea of abolishing private property. And so regardless of what they know or think about the Nazis, who's this random guy Hitler? I've never heard of him. They do see that the Nazis don't like the communists, and that kind of gives them a sort of a sense of sympathy in the minds of some of these voters. Again, these voters aren't listening to speeches. They don't necessarily have radios. They're not going to the meetings. But what they do see is that not only are the Nazis giving lots of speeches, but that the SA guys are putting posters up on the wall, thousands and thousands of posters, and they see the title of the speeches, and they say, the Nazis really don't seem to like that Versailles Treaty thing. You know what? I don't like it either. I might not know much about them. I might not even like them. Maybe I'm aware of the kind of violent side of Nazism, and I actually kind of frown upon that quite heavily. But I do begin to associate the party with certain values that I also share. The Nazis hate Versailles. I hate Versailles. The Nazis hate the communists. I hate the communists. This is an entryway for people to begin to develop sympathies for the parties. And again, even if you find some parts of the Nazis repugnant, even if you say, wow, they're very violent and I don't like that, you hear their claims for example, rearming Germany, for attacking Germany's enemies. And you say, well, I don't like the violence, but at least they're on the right side of things. Many voters who did not vote for the party in 1930, one could argue, may have harbored concerns about its radicalism, but nevertheless, they developed these kind of positive associations with the party that again kind of create an entry point. Now in 1928, 1929 in Northeim, much of this development is going on, is bubbling beneath the political surface. A lot of that kind of conservative nationalist bloc is still interested in traditional parties. But the start of the Great Depression and the collapse of the kind of grand political coalition that had held Weimar together, again, it opens the door to this new era. A moment when local Northeimers became more open to the idea of radical change. And so as these voters are saying, the current system isn't working, I want something really, really different. Oh, by the way, here are these guys who share some of my values, who seem really, really different. I'm going to embrace that. To put some numbers behind this kind of broader trend that I'm talking about, when the September 1930 Reichstag elections take place, the Nazi vote share in Northeim increases from 123 in 1928 to 1,742, or 28% of the overall total in September 1930. Some of this growth in September 1930 will come from people leaving the more traditional parties. But it's worth noting that a significant section also comes from quote-unquote new voters. 3/4 of the people who didn't vote in 1928 but do vote in 1930, 3/4 of them vote for the Nazis. And so simply put, a year into the Great Depression, the Nazis were becoming a major force in Northeim's politics. Now, as the Nazi Party was building support in Northeim using these kind of modern political tactics, another part of the story here is that their non-socialist rivals don't. Okay, this will end the free preview of our Patreon-only episode on the Nazi seizure of power in Northeim. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, as well as the following episode, which will cover basically events from Hitler's ascension to power in January 1933, you can access this by becoming a Patreon supporter for just $2 a month. If you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a website that helps support content creators like myself, and you can just Google Patreon and History Off the Page, and it should take you right to that landing spot. Alternatively, you can find a link to it at our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. Anyway, that's going to be it for now. Thanks for listening, and we hope you join us next time as we take history off the page.